Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with our good friend, Professor Richard Conder, the Prof, and we are continuing our insight into Winston Churchill. It's going to be part two, actually, 1920 through to 1940. Good to see you, Prof.
Hi, Tony. Great to be back with you.
And, we had a good session on the first part of Churchill. Yeah. Looks like it's going to go into a third part because
I think it has
had a very, very full life. Yes. I think is the best way to describe it. Yeah. So today we're going to start off with the 1920s. And I suppose the first shock as far as he was concerned was actually losing his seat in Parliament.
Yes, indeed. I think I'm right in saying the only time he lost his seat, he had failed when he tried to get in when he was a young man, but the only time he lost his seat, before that, he had been part of the Lloyd George coalition from 1916 during the war, and through after the war, Lloyd George called an election in December 1918, just after the end of the First World War, and Churchill was re-elected. Although the Conservatives had by far the biggest number of seats, Lloyd George, who was a Liberal, was kept on as Prime Minister, and he kept Churchill, who at that time was a Liberal, on in his cabinet. And Churchill successively served as Minister of Munitions, and then as Secretary of State for War, and then as Secretary of State for the Colonies. So he had a post-war cabinet career of nearly 4 years. But in around about 1922, it was actually the 1922 committee, which is a Conservative committee, decided that it would pull out of the coalition with Lloyd George, and they called an election. And obviously Churchill stood as a Liberal and lost his seat. Coincidentally, he lost his seat at about the same time as he had an operation for appendicitis, and he wasn't actually able to campaign. And so he later wrote that he lost after nearly 25 years in the House of Commons in various roles. He was without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix. Which was typical Churchill quote, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. Where was his seat at that time?
Now then, that's
was it Oldham still?
Oldham, yes, I think it was Oldham. Yes, he moved around seats a fair bit and stood in a number of different seats. But I think it was Oldham. Yeah, because he then subsequently went. He ended up in Woodford, of course, which was where he was most of the last part of his career. But I think it was Oldham. Now Bonar Law very briefly became Prime Minister in 1922. He was leader of the Conservative Party, but he was a dying man. And shortly after that, he had to leave office after less than a year in office, and Stanley Baldwin became leader of the Conservative Party. And
Baldwin held that position right through to the abdication, didn't it?
Yeah, until 1937.
Yeah.
Up to the abdication and beyond.
Now, it's interesting because the Irish settlement forms part of the Churchill psyche, I suppose you would say. And of course, that was 100 years ago exactly, wasn't it?
It was. And he was closely involved in that before he lost his election in achieving that settlement. He helped draft the Anglo-Irish Treaty and was closely involved with Lloyd George in discussions with people like Collins and so on, who from Sinn Féin, in actually temporarily resolving the Irish question up to them, which was to create partition and the 4 counties of Northern Ireland and the rest of the independent Irish Free State. So he was directly involved in that.
Partitions never really work out, do they? You think of India and Pakistan, you think of Cyprus and other places. There's always tension.
There's always tension. There seems to almost to be an inevitability. It takes a long while of it only going one way, but and we're seeing that today. But it was the first time, and Churchill, as I say, was directly involved in those negotiations. As far as I can understand from my research, was very constructive in his dealings with the Irish politicians. he had a bit of a reputation from the Irish War of Independence, because he did support the use of the paramilitary Black and Tans, who have a very, very bad reputation for the way they dealt with the Irish. So difficult to say. He didn't have an unblemished record. No politician does in terms of his record in Ireland, but he certainly was constructively involved in achieving the 1922 settlement.
But the Irish situation was never held against him in the same way that Dardanelles and Gallipoli were.
No, it was strange. I mean, the things that really stand against his reputation, all of which are worthy of being challenged, were the Dardanelles, the Gallipoli, his role in the general strike in 1926, and earlier the belief much earlier in his career that he sent troops to Tony.at to deal with the miners' strike. That was around about 1910. No, that one certainly doesn't stand up to scrutiny, but it was held against him for many years. But these things become items of legend, and they always become realised fact when actually it was a very different situation. So those are the three events in his political life which were used against him politically. And in so, I mean, as many people say, he was a politician. He was fighting a politician's battles in many cases, and his career is not without blemish. No politician's is, but you always have, you balance the amazing achievements and the liberal approach to social policy against perhaps errors in other areas.
How long was he out of Parliament then, Richard? If he, and also, did he, when he stood again, take the Conservative whip?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Churchill was passionately anti-communist, and that washed into being passionately anti-socialist. Now, the Labour Party was starting to grow had done over the previous 2 decades, but was starting to become a realistic party of opposition in the early 1920s and really supplanting the Liberal Party. So Baldwin, when he became Prime Minister, called an election. And I think Churchill stood in one of the Leicester constituencies as a Liberal and lost. But by then, he was starting to fall out of love, if you like, with the Liberal Party, because he urged them to stand with the Conservatives, to stand against socialism, the Labour Party, I get. And the Liberal Party wouldn't do that. By that time, the Liberal Party had split anyway, and you had a Lloyd George Liberal Party, and you had an Asquith Liberal Party, which of course is always suicide for any party. So during the period between 1922 and 24, and Baldwin lost the 22 election that he called, or at least Ramsay MacDonald's Labour Party was the biggest party and formed the first minority Labour Party government. During that time, Churchill gradually moved away from the Liberals, first of all calling himself a constitutionalist, and then in effect becoming an independent Tory. So in 1924, after the Ramsay MacDonald government had fallen, he was approached by Baldwin and was invited to rejoin the Conservative, the Tory party, which he did. And of course, Baldwin won the 1924 election quite well. And Churchill by then was a fully fledged member of the Tory party again, having taken the whip. Has to be said, though, it took a very, very long while for some members of the Tory party to accept him back in as a fully fledged member of the Tory party. And that really carried on right the way through until he became a member of until he became Prime Minister. And there's a bit of a story to tell there, which we'll come to in a minute. But yeah, he was back in the Tory party after the 1924 election. And somewhat bizarrely, Baldwin made him Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, I think Churchill had many qualities, most of them in areas of social policy, but he wouldn't have described himself personally as a financial wizard. But
he ran on a permanent deficit, didn't he?
Well, yes, he did.
Personally.
Yes, his own finances are the subject of a book called Churchill's Finances, which yes, he ran his life on he had a Rolls-Royce life on a Skoda. He says as an owner of a Skoda car, Skoda engineering. But he did a number of good things as Chancellor of the Exchequer, but he is mostly remembered for taking the country back onto the gold standard in his first budget at 1914 parity. And in truth, that was a disaster. It was a disaster because although it was deemed to be propping up sterling, the British economy after the First World War wasn't robust enough to trade at a fixed exchange rate determined by the value of gold, which meant he took away from himself and from the government the ability to manipulate interest rates, to manipulate the exchange rate. And of course, the country, it was a key factor in the depression, the UK depression of the late 1920s and early 30s. And in effect, although it was, if you like, maintained the parity and the importance of sterling as a trading currency, it hobbled the UK economy for the next number of years. So that was probably would generally be regarded as quite a serious mistake. Certainly, it was against the advice of people like John Maynard Keynes and other famous economists of the time. But he did do, nonetheless, again in terms of social policy as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he did introduce a number of liberal measures, which included things like widows' pensions, reduced income tax, and imposed taxes on luxury goods, reduced military expenditure, which was a bit bizarre given his future demands for increasing military expenditure. But yes, he some of what he did was quite liberal, particularly things like widows' pensions and so on. But he was Chancellor for a full 5 years, and there aren't many chancellors who last that long.
That's right.
Probably the longest time he had as a cabinet minister before he became prime minister. So he presented 5 budgets, a slightly stranger appointment for him. Of course, during that period, as I've already mentioned, there was the general strike, and he was well known running the government's newspaper against and again, as I said earlier, he was very much an anti-communist. At that time, Russia had gone communist. The Tsar's family had been murdered. There was a real fear that a similar sort of revolution could happen in the UK. And he was, as we said before, an imperialist and a monarchist. So he was determined that wasn't going to happen. Yes, again, perhaps his track record around the general strike would not have necessarily been one that he's well affectionately remembered for. Although he did, again, it's well documented, he did try to ameliorate the effects of what the mine owners were doing to the miners, and tried to bring in things like pit head baths and minimum wages. But he's not remembered for that. It's rather he's remembered for his fairly strident approach to the general strike and the government's position.
So the general strike started off with a mining dispute, which escalated into involving virtually everybody in the country, whatever business they were in, whatever industry they were in.
The TUC, the Trade Union Congress, there was a miners' strike for 9 days, I think. Oh, no, I may get this wrong, but there was a miners' strike, and then that became a full general strike, the only general strike I think that's happened in the country. And that lasted for a number of days when basically the country came to a halt. But gradually, I think it'd be true to say that because of lack of wages, the miners eventually, the TUC had to call it off. And the reduction in miners' wages and so on was sustained. This was all part of the deflationary impact of post-war economics and what happened on Wall Street in 1929. So all of that was part of the Depression. Very, very very, very difficult times for ordinary working people, many of whom, of course, had just come out of the trenches.
Well, that's the point, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it, when you sort of look at history back over the last 100 years or so, the number of times coal miners have been in confrontation with governments and strikes and everything else, even up to the time of Mrs. Thatcher.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think most people certainly would recognise that the coal miner had one of the toughest jobs in the labour market, perhaps only matched by people like, I don't know, people on trawlers and so on in the North Sea.
Yeah, steel manufacture, perhaps.
Yeah, so that they have always been seen as deserving of special.
They were obviously well organised, though, in terms of their trade union and everything else.
They were built around communities, but it was a horrendous, very, very tough job. And of course, it wasn't nationalised. The mines were owned by private mine owners who would negotiate deals with their own mine, their own workforce. It's interesting. I've just been reading a book on Ernie Bevan, who was the Minister of Labour in the Second World War. And they actually had to draft the Bevan boys into the mines in the war because they didn't have enough. The miners, if they didn't get the coal out the ground, the war industries then would grind to a halt. So they had to draft in non-miners into the mine to make up the mining labour, and that created all sorts of tensions. But of course, until relatively, certainly through the Edward Heath governments of the 70s and the Margaret Thatcher governments of the 80s, the coal mining was absolutely crucial to keeping the lights on and keeping power going, keeping industry going. Obviously, much less so now with the advent of North Sea oil and other forms of energy. But and also the whole of the world turning against hydrocarbons as a source of fuel. But yeah, I mean, they were absolutely critical to the driving the economic engine, which of the whole country.
So we get over the national strike, the general strike in 1926, and then head up to the end of the decade, and of course the Wall Street crash.
Well, yes, and Churchill himself personally lost a lot of money in the Wall Street crash. In 1929, an election was called, and we had in effect the second Labour government under Ramsay MacDonald. But and Churchill retained his seat, but was out of office, part of the opposition, and but being out of office, he then devoted himself to speak. As you said, he needed to make money, so he started his books on the First World War called The World Crisis. He started his Life of Marlborough, so he was a great writer. And he also went on speaking engagements in the United States in particular, essentially to make money, to repay some of those debts. And it was while he was in America that he'd invested quite heavily on Wall Street, and just at the wrong time, and he lost a huge amount of money. I mean, probably, I can't really put a figure on it, but potentially, I think probably £1 million in today's money. Easily,
I would have thought. Interesting with that American tour, because I've been reading another book about his son, his relationship with his son Randolph. Recommended by Mrs. LeBlanc, of course. And Randolph accompanied him on that trip, I believe.
There's another whole story about Winston Churchill and Randolph Churchill.
Well, it's exactly the opposite to Winston's relationship with his own father.
Indeed. Winston, he was a very indulging father, because as we said in our last, Winston had a very difficult relationship with his own father, Randolph, and with his he had 5 children, one of whom sadly died, Marigold. But with his 4 surviving children, he was a very indulgent father. But that sort of came back to haunt him, because he certainly had very, very significant issues throughout his life with Randolph, who he loved, but seriously indulged. So, I mean, Randolph went on the American tour with him. Subsequently, Randolph took himself off on his own American tour, and he dropped out of Oxford against his father's wishes, and took himself off on a speaking tour to make himself money. But that's probably another story. So Churchill the number of things happened to Churchill. He was also involved in a very nasty car crash in Chicago, where he looked the wrong way crossing the road.
As one does.
On the road, and he was very badly injured and hospitalised, and then I eventually came back to the UK, but then got himself better and went back to the States to finish his lecture tour. Not least, I suspect, because he needed the money. But yes, so during that time, as they did in those days, he wasn't really in Parliament very much, but he did fall out very significantly with Stanley Baldwin, which we'll come to in a moment, I'm sure, about the whole issue of Indian independence, which was another one of his, if you like, a bête noire of his political career, if you like, and left the shadow cabinet at that time over disputes with Baldwin about the Conservative Party's stance and support for Indian independence. So by around about 1931-32, he was effectively starting what are generally known as his wilderness years, because he was out of sorts with successive Tory leaders and Tory influencers, and wasn't in government, and was really devoted himself both to newspaper columns, to his own writings, as I said, the Marlborough Project, history of the Duke of Marlborough, his relative, his ancestors, and speaking engagements. That's how he made his money.
As we sort of look at the early 30s, he was a devout imperialist, wasn't he, in terms of his enthusiasm for the British Empire. And of course, 1931 sees Canada and Australia getting Dominion status effectively. And I think at that time, India was on the list, wasn't it?
It went through various phases. The Dominion, the Indian, particularly the Congress Party, which was led by Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, wanted full independence. There were whole sets of issues in India around the majority Hindu population and the minority Muslim population, which always and did ultimately produce huge conflagration, but that was an issue about actually moving India to some sort of level of independence. So the leaders of the Indian independence movement wanted full independence. So there's always this progressive negotiation between the UK government and the Viceroy in terms of what was achievable without turning India into creating terrible conflict in India amongst its indigenous populations, but also in terms of what the British government could get through Parliament. But there was a general agreement that it had to happen, whether it would be Dominion status or full independence, and various offers were made, such as a transitional arrangement, most of which were rejected by Gandhi, because he wanted full independence. And I think successive British governments, both the Ramsay MacDonald Labour government, what then became the national government, which was like a coalition of Tories and Labour Party, led by Ramsay MacDonald, also were pushing for some sort of dominion or independence. And Churchill was not entirely on his own, but was certainly out of step with the government, and certainly in a relatively small minority. Now, yes, he was undoubtedly was an imperialist. I mean, he was a man of his time. You have to remember that Churchill was a Victorian, born in 1875, and he grew up steeped in the idea of empire, and the greatness of Britain was based upon its empire. So that was a big, but he saw it as a paternalistic force for good. That would not be accepted now. But that was where his whole of his upbringing, the political culture of the time was. I read a really interesting article by Max Hastings, a brilliant author, who himself has written a biography of Churchill. And the article was called "We Are All Prisoners of the Times We Live in." And his last line was, "We need to challenge what's happened in the past, but with one critical caveat. We cannot demand from peoples of the past the values and language we think appropriate today." So when we judge Churchill's imperialism, we have to remember basically he was, to a large extent, he was echoing exactly what the whole world thought when he was growing up. But he was very slow. You can't get away from the fact that he was very slow to come to terms with the legitimate demands of indigenous populations who were ruled by what essentially was a foreign country.
At what point did he realise that the Hitler situation was developing into something that could end up in World War II?
I think he saw that very early on, around about 1933. He saw it he saw the militarism of Hitler, his demands for space, the intolerance of the Nazi regime, their attitude towards the Jewish people and other minorities. And he did an international broadcast in 1934 where he talked about this nation of 63 million people, whatever it was, a large nation.
Yeah.
Of the most industrious, most productive, most brilliant nation, who are now being led by these people who are a threat to all of us. And for the first time, the United Kingdom, which is a smaller population, faces a genuine threat of invasion for the first time in a millennium, and from attack from the air for the first time ever. And we have to remember that the fear in the 30s about air bombing was the same that we experienced as young people in terms of nuclear holocaust. It was believed that the country would be effectively wiped out by bombing. And so he made that broadcast, which was to the world in 34. So he picked that up then, and started to challenge both MacDonald's government and then Stanley Baldwin's government right the way through to 1937. But he was almost a voice in the wilderness. Interestingly, there were a number of other young Tory MPs, much more on the centre-left of the Tory party, who also had the same concerns, classically men who had been in the trenches. And they would include people like Harold Macmillan, Anthony Eden, Robert Boothby, Leo Amery. Now, these were young people who voted and under great threats to their own careers, voted against the Tory government and campaigned for rearmament. But they didn't look to Churchill as their leader. They looked to Anthony Eden. It's often forgotten that Churchill was in the wilderness. And although he certainly in the early 30s, really up until 37, 38, he was not seen as the leader of the opponents to Hitler and to the government. Anthony Eden was thought to be the prince over the water who would take over.
He had the looks.
He had the looks. And he didn't have all the baggage that Churchill carried. From the Dardanelles, from the Indian issue, which certainly counted against him, the general strike. There was this view that Churchill was prone to wild flights of policy and ideas which were not well thought through. But interestingly, Anthony Eden, unlike Churchill, didn't have the stomach for the fight. He would not take over, not become leader of that group of, if you like, rebels. But every time Churchill, it looked as if Churchill would gain a following within the Tory party, he would do something in the mid-30s which would damage his standing and put him outside of the pale. One was the India question, which really he was in a very small minority. And then, of course, there was the abdication crisis, where he unequivocally supported Edward VIII's right to stay on the throne of Mary Wallace Simpson, when he was so far away from the general. He was almost in a minority of one. And he lost all of the credibility at the end of 1936 that he'd gradually been building up in terms of the need for rearmament. I mean, he was so well researched in terms of what was happening in Germany, what was happening in terms of our own armaments industry and our own rearmaments, that he was in a very powerful position. But in one speech in December 36, over the abdication, he lost all of his credibility for a number of months and years, and effectively had to start again.
It's incredible.
He was actually shouted down in the House.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? How somebody who's obviously very, very wise can get it so wrong at those sort of stages in his political career. How did he back down on Edward VIII? Did he just, sort of say, I got it wrong, and shrugged his shoulders?
He basically he supported Edward's right to remain on the throne, and that a solution should have been found, but he was massively outvoted in the House, as I think tiny, perhaps one or two others.
Yeah,
and I think that yet again undermined his reputation. I was going to say unfair reputation, but his reputation for being a bit wild and being a bit irrational and a bit erratic, going back to things like the Dardanelles and so I don't think he ever backed down. He just became irrelevant because Baldwin had the country behind him, and certainly had both the Labour Party, the Tory Party, and all of the rest of the empire in terms of the leaders of the countries in the empire. None of them were prepared to accept Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson as Queen. So he just read it wrong.
Yeah.
But in fairness to him, he was a passionate monarchist. He then became a very great, passionate supporter of George VI.
Which was reciprocated.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So, during the war, he was very, very careful to distance the then Duke of Windsor from anything to do with UK policy, any role in war. And as he was it Bermuda, I think, or the Bahamas?
Bahamas. Yeah, Governor General, wasn't it? Governor
General, which was basically just to keep him away. So
it was either that or South Georgia.
Yes, yeah.
Tell us a bit about the Munich crisis now, Richard.
Well,
because this is now leading up to the war, isn't it?
Leading up to the war, and this is really where Churchill comes into his own, because by 1937, Chamberlain takes over from Baldwin as Prime Minister. Baldwin resigned immediately after King George VI's coronation in June of 37. Chamberlain, the only candidate. There was a thought that he might invite Churchill back, but there was no way Chamberlain was going to have Churchill in his cabinet. So Churchill by then is getting fed through various sources huge amounts of information about the failure to rearm the United Kingdom armed forces, and is able to produce statistics in the House of Commons to refute both what Baldwin had said about rearmament and the relative state of the RAF compared to the Luftwaffe. He was able to refute those and prove they were wrong. And then gradually people were a minority of the Tory party, people like I've said, Macmillan and Boothby, were starting to become really concerned about, if you like, the failure of the United Kingdom to take a moral stance in terms of what was happening in Germany, and the general appeasement of the dictators, Mussolini, but obviously mostly Hitler. So the Munich crisis occurred, which, as our watchers will know, was about Czechoslovakia. Before that, Hitler had basically bullied Austria into what was called Anschluss, where Austria became part of Germany. And then Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, which was the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, which had been set up after the First World War. Chamberlain, who had no experience of foreign policy, but seemed to believe he had a special gift for negotiating with dictators, out of the blue started this one-to-one dialogue with Hitler. And Chamberlain, a man who had never flown in his life, decided to fly on 3 occasions to Germany to negotiate directly with Hitler over the Sudetenland. And in the end, effectively put pressure on the, along with the French, because the French were guarantors of the Czechoslovakian boundaries, as were we. He put pressure, Daladier, the French Prime Minister, and Chamberlain put pressure on the Czech President, Czech Prime Minister, to hand over the Sudetenland to Germany. And that effectively gave all of Czechoslovakia's borders, its fortifications, and most significantly, the Skoda armaments works to Germany. And you have to remember that the nation thought it was going to war in September 38. And when Chamberlain came back, there was universal rejoicing.
With the piece of paper.
Chamberlain had the country absolutely behind him.
Yeah.
With a few tiny minority of people who said this is the blackest day, it's immoral, and what's happened is a disgrace in terms of the United Kingdom, Great Britain's reputation. But most of the population didn't feel like that. They'd been digging trenches and trying on gas masks and working out how to evacuate children. So even at that stage, Chamberlain did have the country behind him. But one person consistently since 1934 who had been warning about the militarism of Hitler and the Nazis and the fascist dictators generally, had been demanding rearmament, that Great Britain rearms, was Churchill. So between Munich, September 38, and the outbreak of war in September 39, Hitler's actions became more and more dangerous, more and more threatening. And the country at large very quickly realized that Munich was really just selling the pass and was a stain on the reputation of of Great Britain and in history. Interestingly, the famous phrase, Hitler claiming he had no further demands in Europe. Just 6 months after the Munich Agreement, less than 6 months, I think, 15th of March, 1939, Hitler walked into the whole of the rest of Czechoslovakia, having said that Sudetenland was his last claims on territory. So less than 6 months after Chamberlain come back waving his piece of paper, Hitler ignored all the promises and just marched took over the whole of Czechoslovakia without warning.
So we know that essentially the war starts because Hitler invades Poland. Okay. Yeah, correct.
Immediately after the German-Soviet Pact, late August 39, which effectively gave Hitler the Stalin and Hitler agreed to slice up Poland between them. That's effectively what they did. Interestingly, Chamberlain at that time had been trying to negotiate a pact with Russia himself, but had been done it in such a loose way that Hitler, Ribbentrop and so on, Molotov, Stalin put this pact together at very short notice, August of 39. Within days, Hitler, 1st of September, tanks rolled into Poland. And 3 weeks later, Poland effectively had to surrender.
But
and the First World War started.
What was the justification? The fact the treaty had been broken? What made Poland the hot point?
Well, after the 15th of March, when Hitler and the Germans had taken over the whole of Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain, somewhat uncharacteristically, gave guarantees to Poland, as did France, in terms of borders. It's fairly clear that even after Hitler invaded, Chamberlain would, even those 2 or 3 days before Great Britain declared war on the 3rd of September 39, that Chamberlain would have looked for ways to renegotiate. And of course, even the final note that Chamberlain, the British government, gave to Germany said that if Germany withdrew from Poland, we would not go to war. But of course, they didn't do that. So Chamberlain, even late on in the day, was looking for a way to avoid war. I mean, a lot of these people, not Chamberlain himself, still had memories of the First World War and the slaughter. You can understand why almost anything would have been done to avoid war. But there was no way. You just couldn't read Hitler there was no way that war with Germany could be avoided.
Okay, just to finish off this session, Churchill suddenly becomes flavour of the month again and returns to the Admiralty. What triggered that?
Well, as soon as war was declared, Chamberlain, there had been a huge demand for Churchill to be brought into the government. Through August and in September, Chamberlain offered Churchill the position, First Lord of the Admiralty, which is a position he'd occupied in the First World War, at the start of the First World War, and also made him a member of the War Cabinet. So Churchill actually became probably the most dynamic member of what was a very undynamic war government for those first 8 or 9 months of the war. Really, the only place that any action was taken against Germany was on the sea. There was the Battle of the River Plate, the Graf Spee being sunk in November, and it was Churchill who was pushing for intervention in Norway to try to stop Swedish iron ore being exported via through the Norwegian seas to Germany. Yeah. And then in April, there was what was again effectively a disastrous Norwegian campaign. British Army was ferried across the North Sea to northern Norway, inevitably just a few days too late because Hitler had invaded Norway just a few days before. Our troops were completely ill-equipped, and fairly quickly the British Army was driven out of Norway. Germany occupied the whole of Norway, so secured its iron supplies, secured its eastern seaboard in terms of the North Sea. HMS Victorious was sunk, one of our most important aircraft carriers was sunk in the North Sea. And in early May, shortly after that debacle, there was a debate in the House of Commons. And it was pretty clear by then that Chamberlain stays as Prime Minister and the whole of his government, the Tory government, because it was not a coalition, stays were numbered. There was a very, very fractious debate around the 8th, 9th and 10th of, 8th and 9th of May, 1940, where there were many famous speeches made, but one by Lloyd George, the old line of the First World War, said, Prime Minister has asked for sacrifice, the greatest sacrifice the Prime Minister could make to ensure the success of this war would be to give up his seals of office. And that was very, very damning. And Leo Amery used the famous Cromwell phrase, for all the good you do here, in the name of God, go. And that was a Cromwell phrase that he used in terms of the Long Parliament many centuries earlier. So although the Conservatives had a huge majority from the 1935 election, about 80 members either voted against or abstained, which was a shock for Chamberlain of his own side. So pressure came upon, he realised he had to resign. And the choice was between Halifax and Churchill. There was a lot of support for Halifax. Chamberlain would have liked Halifax to be Prime Minister, as would King George VI. And a lot of the Tory party would have done. In fact, probably the majority of the Tory party would have opted for Halifax. But it was fairly clear Halifax was an appeaser. He was tarnished with although by then I think he himself had realised that there was no appeasing Hitler. But he was tarnished with that. It's also almost impossible by then for a Lord to lead a government from the House of Lords.
Yeah.
So Churchill had decided just to say nothing in his meeting with Chamberlain and Halifax. And in the end, Halifax, in the face of the silence from Churchill, did say, I don't believe I can be Prime Minister. And so Chamberlain then went and resigned. And Churchill was invited by King George VI to become Prime Minister on the 10th of May, 1940. And as Churchill said, I felt as if my whole life had been but preparation for this moment. But he was not leader of the Tory party, interestingly. Chamberlain remained leader of the Tory party. And many members of the Tory party found it difficult to accept him. Rab Butler described him as, said that the Tory party said, we have weakly surrendered to a half-breed American whose main support was that of an inefficient but talkative people of a similar type. And that half-breed American was Winston Churchill. And that's how Rab Butler, who was Halifax's second in command at the Foreign Office, and obviously a senior Tory, described the man who'd just become Prime Minister.
I think this is a good time to close it, Richard, because we've dealt with the 20s and 30s. Thank you very, very much for your time as ever. And anyone watching this, there is a previous version available from Churchill's birth through to the end of the First World War. If you go into Tony.at.12 on your browser, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. So many, many thanks, Richard, for all of your contribution today. We're going to obviously finish it off in due course, the 1940s through to 65 when he died. So looking forward to that. But meantime, thanks ever so.
Thank you. Pleasure, Tony. Thank you.